All right, let's go ahead and see if the screen share works. All right, can you all see my screen? All right, awesome. So welcome to my talk. I am Laura Micek. The title of the talk is called From Idea to Deployment, Understanding Development Best Practice. I wrote this whole kind of long paragraph, but I don't expect you to read that. Basically, all it says is I'm going to be going over some best practices for creating a development project. This is aimed at all levels, and it covers planning, setting up a development environment, coding best practices, testing, documentation, deployment, and then conclusion. And I all tried to make these like kind of logical as far as like what order you would do these in terms of how you would go about uh, basically starting a project. So I'll go into my intro first. So again, my name is Laura Micek. If you would like to look up my resume or anything related to my work history, you can definitely scan that QR code and that will take you to my LinkedIn. Or you can actually publicly find this repo on GitHub. It's under this Micek ATO 2024. This was actually put together for a talk that I'm doing for a conference called All Things Open, which is actually happening in a couple weeks. So this is kind of like my dry run. So you get to tell me what I'm doing wrong tonight. So thank you for being my test subjects. All right. So I've been told that a lot of presentations in development are not very interactive, and so I'm gonna change that tonight and do an experiment. So I play D&D as one of my hobbies, and we're gonna play a little experiment where I give you this QR code, and then you answer this question, which is, what do you think I will roll on a 6-sided dice? And I'll tell you some fun math facts after, but I'll just give you a minute to do that so that you have time to scan the code or visit this URL here and enter in these fun little numbers. Either one is completely fine. They both work or should work. I didn't test this completely, so we'll see how it goes. I trust the software, so it looks like 4 is the winner currently. Okay. That is a good good guess. Any other guesses? Actually, I'm not entirely sure if this means that you all guessed 4 or if one person guessed 4. I haven't figured that out yet, so we'll figure that out at some point. But yeah, it looks like 4 is what we're going for. So I'll actually do this on the browser, so you can actually see me roll versus in person. When I give this talk in person, I'm actually going to have dice with me, and I'm actually going to do a dice roll. But just for sake of fairness, I will go to Google and do roll a d6. And they have this fun little app here in case you've never seen this before. You just hit roll. And that tracks. I normally roll terribly, so yeah, sorry. I let the fours down. uh, but funny enough, statistically, I looked this up earlier. 2 is actually the hardest number to roll statistically for some reason. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I'll share that fun fact with you. Oh yeah, so that was my interactive part of this talk. So let's dive right into the actual topic at hand, which is understanding development best practice. So when you first start out creating a development project, you want to do planning ahead of time. Um, in this talk, I'm not going to cover specific technologies per se. I will definitely show you some options, but I'm not saying that these particular tools or technologies are the thing you should use. I'm saying that you should pick a tool or a technology that works best for your particular use case. Um, but in the sake of argument, I'm showing ones that prove my point, basically. So it's really important to plan your project because it allows you to track your work. You can also link code changes back to your um, actual set of requirements that you're using to check your project. And it also helps whenever you run into any issues, say that your application breaks and you're trying to troubleshoot. It's super easy when you're actually using a planning tool or something to help you track that work. So I'll show you what that means. Basically, you create different what's called referred to as stories in Agile, and that's how you kind of track this type of work. So as you can see here, I created a story for setting up this technology called MKDocs. I added a label to it so that you can refer to it in the code base. And if you actually go to my repo, you can look at my commit history and go back through the commits and see this is the particular change that I made for that particular story. And you can see all the different changes that I made related to that work. So making sure that you kind of have this planning in place is really helpful in making sure that you're following that best practice. I think one thing that I'm definitely going to add here is you always want to have a description. So there's actually two ways that you can do this. You can do and I'm going to have to look it up later, but it's called as a, uh, and that's usually a role as a, say user. I want to something so that this is accomplished. So this is just a type of way to format your story. There's also this other type of way to do this, which is given when then. And that just is using those terms to describe what you're accomplishing in a particular story. But again, this is something that is usually decided by a team and not, there's no like one way to do story writing. You pretty much just pick the one that works best for your team. Yeah, so just wanted to make sure we pointed out that you can label or have some kind of tracking number to use in your code base. So the next section I want to dive into is setting up your dev environment. So once you have done some planning and you've got your repo created, that's when you can actually start to set this environment up. One thing I definitely recommend before you even write a single line of code is to get your README started. And so this should include things like a description of your project. And most importantly, it should include how to start up your project. So like once you get to a place where you can run your code, you need to include the instructions in your README on how to run your project. Because ultimately, you'll save yourself a lot of time if other people are using this code base. You'll save yourself time not having to answer the questions on, hey, where do I find this? How do I run this? How do I get this to work? If you outline that in your README, you'll avoid trying to fill some of those questions. So that's my advice for, getting started on your dev environment. Which leads me into coding best practice. So these are just a handful of kind of best practices that I've seen over the years. I've been in development for over 21 years now, and so these are kind of ones that stood out to me as kind of like the most important things you should keep in mind when you're coding. So the first one I have here is when you're creating a new branch, start a new feature. Okay, yeah, I need to reword that. So when you start a new feature, you want to create a branch and you want to add the story uh, associated to that branch name. So as I showed before, I had that label that designates which plan story that relates to, um, which it's matching up to adding coding best practice, which is here. So um, all of your kind of prep for setting up branches and comments and stuff should be able to link back to the story work that you are using to track what you're creating, basically. And here's this example here. So this part will change depending on what type of work you're doing. So if you are fixing a bug, you would change this to bug fix. And you can actually Google the different types of stories that you can have, and this will change depending on that. And then as far as this goes, it's kind of standard to have a way to track um, by using an ID of some kind and then a description of what you're actually doing in that particular code change. Which will go into my next point of you should definitely commit early and often. And I've linked to this conventional commits website, which basically talks about what you should be putting in your commit when you're kind of pushing your code to a repo. And this kind of just tells what you're doing at each step. And you can actually go back and see if you go to your commit history. You can actually see this in your code base, so it's a little bit easier to like figure out what you were doing at that particular step in your project. So it just adds to that kind of idea of keeping things clean and organized. So the next point I wanted to go into is try to avoid using abbreviations. So I've seen this actually quite frequently, but it's one of those like habits I think people have to try to train themselves to break. So they'll like do something like I'm trying to think of a good one. Hmm. Oh, so I saw like someone abbreviate data table to DT the other day. DT could mean a bunch of different things. So it's really important to kind of spell out in your code what things are because other people are going to look at your code. And so it's really important to make sure everything is as readable as possible because you're not the only one that's going to be hopefully contributing to your code base. This is another one that I see kind of violated pretty frequently, which is wait until your pull request comments are resolved before you merge your code. And I know a lot of the times people don't want to abide by this rule because they feel like their change is so important. And once they get the approvals, they're like just ready to merge their code in once that button turns green. But it's important that you do make sure that you're answering all of your comments and making sure that everyone that has left a comment understands the direction and the reasons why you made a particular change. I've I've seen it to where it does conflict as well if you don't kind of address those comments before you merge too. So it's always just a good idea to just take the time to make sure that everyone's good with the changes before it gets merged in. Otherwise, you're going to have to deal with it later on. It's like kind of pick your battle kind of scenario here. And then my last point is just to clean up your branches on both your remote and local. And this is just so that you don't leave a bunch of old code just like lingering around. It's not going to interact with your main branch or anything, but It's actually a thing that gets measured in a lot of companies to make sure that you don't have long-lived branches and just having code out there like lingering around. So that is my kind of last bit of coding best practice advice. So let's dive into testing. Again, just put together a list of testing, and I will give you all the kind of heads up that I wasn't a kind of a test. Well, no, that I would say advocate. It took me time to get into testing, basically. Like, I wasn't taught that testing was something that we do up front or anything like that. Even in school, there was no big like drive for people to test. But it's funny because testing is like one of the most important things that you do when you're creating um, a new feature or adding to your application or creating a new application, because it makes sure that your code is working the way that it should. So again, I'm not recommending any particular framework because there are frameworks out there for every single language, and a lot of them are super easy to add into your project. So I would just say do your research, find the one that works best for you, and have fun testing. And I did write, my next point is hopefully the code has been written with the single responsibility principle in mind. Um, and the single responsibility is it just basically says a code or the code that you write should be so small that it only accomplishes one single responsibility. So like if you create a calculator and you have an add function, it should only do adding. It shouldn't do any other type of operation. It should just be getting a number in, adding the number, returning the number. And that's kind of like the idea behind single responsibility. Um, so I was saying that it should be written that way so that your test can be small in scope, because you don't want to write a super long test. But that doesn't mean you can't test many things. It just means that your tests should be really small in size so that it's easy to run through them and you know easily where something would fail if it did fail. And then my note for that one is you can always refactor your code. So say it's not following the single responsibility principle, you can change it to be so. So I always try to remind people that refactoring should be done. Um, every time we create something, it's not going to be perfect the first draft. So it's always important to keep iterating and looking at your code and seeing if you can improve it. Which actually flows into my next point of keeping your tests organized. Make sure that they're following a logical kind of organizational path. So like if you have a class, keep all of your class or your tests for those particular classes in one section and then divide it out based on like the function or method or whatever you're testing. And then my next point is make sure you're covering more than just the happy path, which means if you say are writing this calculator, for example, don't just check to make sure that it outputs the added number. You would also want to check some different things related to your calculator. For instance, to make sure that it got called. And there are all kinds of different features that are available in different test suites that you can like use to test different things. So just make sure that you're thoroughly testing your code. Which leads into my final point, which is make sure your tests are consistent and have good amount of code coverage. And code coverage is based on how many tests that you write that actually hit every single line of your code. You definitely want this to be as high as possible. Um, but at the same time, make sure that your tests are meaningful, meaning you could test that addition line by just, again, just writing the happy path, and then that gets you to 100% coverage very easily. But you want to make sure that your tests are more meaningful than that, and they're covering all aspects, because if it hits an edge case that you didn't account for, that could break your application. So you definitely want to make sure you're doing enough testing. So after you finish your testing, I recommend leading into this next one, which is documentation. In my personal opinion, it's one of the most important things besides your code and your tests. And you can have several types of documentation. You can have documentation in your code, so like having code comments that detail out what your function does, what type of parameters it accepts, what kind of return that you have on a particular function. These are things that you should have all throughout your code. And there are tools too that will actually auto-generate a nice little kind of documentation site like this for you based on your code comments. And then the next one I talk about is the documentation that lives in your code base. And you can actually see that this particular technology that I'm using lives in my code base. So if you go into here, this is the docs folder, which contains all of these different markdown files that make up this nice little experience here. And there is one configuration file that tells it basically where each one of the pages are, and it tells it how to display things. It tells it that these links go at the top, and a bunch of other little small things that you can put in to make this more customized, basically. And so besides that, there's also other documentation that exists outside your code base as well. So things that you might want to add that maybe a tool like this doesn't support. And sometimes you'll see that organizations have created these other avenues to put documentation that live outside of code bases. So it's kind of important to keep that organized so that you know where to find the right information. But ultimately, try to keep as much of the documentation you can inside of your code base, because it's version controlled, and that will help you to keep track of any changes that happen within your code base. And it should be a living kind of document. Like anytime that you make a code base change, you should also be making sure that any documentation that relates to that is also updated, just like you would update your test coverage as well. So like all of these things should be accounted for in that work that you plan for in this whole planning tool. And I can actually add in some more details for that later on. But yeah, everything should be contained in this kind of story that relates to the work. And then lastly, but not, I guess, to say that it's the least important, is deployment. Because if you didn't have deployment, your code wouldn't go anywhere. It would just sit in a repo, and it wouldn't do anything. It would just be there to look at. So that's when deployment is so important. You need to have a deployment that is two things. First of all, you want it to be automated so that when you push a code change to your repo, it gets picked up by whatever deployment tool you're using and can run through and do some checks and then deploy your solution, basically. The other thing is, though, that it should be able to be triggered manually, because say something goes wrong while you're trying to deploy and you get an error. It's nice to be able to kind of look through, and that's my next part here, pay attention to your logs, because if you have something happen, you want to look at your logs and see what the issue is, kind of dig into what it means, do some research, whatever search engine you want to use, you can look up what the error message means. Um, and so being able to trigger something manually is needed sometimes just to do some more testing and kind of troubleshoot through that. And another point here I make is that it's nice to have a file that will run your deployment steps. That way you can actually put it on your repo alongside your code. And as I mentioned before, it'll be version controlled and you will be able to track all the different changes that get made to that file. Another point I'm making here is to keep the steps in your deployment file very lean. You don't want to put everything under the sun in one step. You want to separate it out and make sure that you're trying to follow that, again, single responsibility principle, and make sure that you're only achieving one goal each time that you go through a step in your deployment. And then use consistent and meaningful naming conventions. This also can apply toward any of the different sections that I went through as well, which can kind of highlight why it's a very important thing. So yeah, in conclusion, I've kind of gone through and highlighted some of the different best practices that I've kind of encountered over the years. But ultimately, it comes down to what your actual team decides. But of course, I am always advocating for these type of practices. I realize I have a typo here, so I'll fix that. Actually, I'll go ahead and add a story. Actually, I already have a cleanup story. So correct typo on my conclusion. I make mistakes too, so it's a thing that happens. But yeah, that was kind of the end of my talk. Thank you so much for coming tonight and listening to my speech. Are there any questions?
Hi. Can you hear me all
Okay.
right?
Yes.
Two questions. One
Mhm.
is you share this with us.
Yes.
And then the second one is for testing. When
Mhm.
you're coming up with edge cases, I struggle with knowing what sort of weird things to expect or what sort of odd behaviors to look for.
Mhm.
What is your process for determining edge cases or looking for odd behaviors in writing your tests?
So again, I'm not a tester, so I probably am the least experienced person to talk about testing, but I will give you, from my perspective, what I've seen. So as far as testing goes, a lot of times you'll have like a testing plan, and you'll talk to all the people involved on the product or project that you're doing, and they'll give you common use cases for how it works, and then from there you can also kind of brainstorm like, all right, what if the user tries to do this? And like that's how you kind of come up with different cases that you wouldn't normally encounter. But also, we're not perfect. We're not always gonna like come up with, someone that goes in and does something like completely off the wall. And we oftentimes will learn about like something breaking in that way, and that's how we end up creating bugs and stuff to kind of counter those things. Um, However, I do think too that we are now leveraging a lot of AI to help with this testing effort too. So it's been super helpful just as like a getting started kind of thing. So anytime that you're, hitting that roadblock of, oh, I don't know what I should do first, AI is now that first step that you should think about using before you start searching and reaching out to other people in your organization to help you out and, keep expanding on that kind of circle of support. It's a good question, though. Thank you for
Thank
asking.
you.
Any other questions?
So what you're saying is basically, obviously not like a very small test project, but pretty much every project, even individually, you should be using like Trello to come up with like a game plan.
Yeah, so and again, this is not a tool that you have to use or even I'm advocating for. I just throw it together really quickly. And you don't really have to do too much to put this together. But the point I'm trying to advocate for is that your work should be trackable. So any type of code commit, there should be some kind of ID or something that you add to some kind of tracking system to say this work that I'm doing relates to this particular number, and then you can go back through your code base and your commits and see how that lines up and say that something started breaking around 5 days ago. Then I could look at my timestamps here and go, oh, the only thing I did 5 days ago were these stories. And then I could go and look into the documentation, say, or into my planning tools and be like, oh, yeah, I made this comment related to this work and maybe I should dig into that more. So it's just a way to kind of keep yourself organized as you're working through these things. Hmm? Any feedback that you may have? Did you think this was helpful? Is there anything I could improve on besides my typos? Is there anything that was helpful that stood out as something different?
It's definitely good to have interactive stuff.
Yeah, I get that comment all the time about a lot of the kind of engineering presentations that we give. They just are so just continuously hammering just long lines of stuff, like just long lines of text, which I also want to go back and maybe kind of make this less wordy as well. So I also should probably do that. I have 2 weeks to kind of make this in a better state too before the other presentation. So that is something I might start looking into. But yeah, I think the participation thing also gets people kind of their energy up a little bit. And my presentation I think falls after lunch, so that's kind of an uphill battle. uh, but I'm hoping for the best.
Look,
Yeah, thank you. Uh,
these are hard.
right, right. uh, all right, well, that's all I had planned for you tonight. If you have nothing further, we can go ahead and close this meeting out.
Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
thank you so much. Have a good one.
You too.
You too.